So let me just say, I apologize for the late start, and now it's very late because we had issues getting the sound to come out on YouTube. This is the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre, LaRouche Independent candidate for US Senate. It is March 1st, and we are at a moment where mankind clearly is going to move radically away from the status quo. Either we are going to totally transform ourselves and move into a new paradigm, including with the kind of mass strike that we have seen in the protests in the street and various electoral shifts, which I'll get to in a moment, in the West. And the BRICS process, the new paradigm, the rejection of the old British colonial era, or the arrogance and stupidity and extreme delusional quality of the leaders of the US, UK, and the West are going to plunge us off the cliff into thermonuclear annihilation. And we had at the beginning of this week the very disturbing, I will say, action, profoundly gripping, as I believe it was intended to do, of the active duty airman Aaron Bushnell, 25 years old, who did what he called an extreme protest of self-immolation. He set himself on fire on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. He had created a link, given his possessions away, advertising for people to watch on Twitch as he doused himself in some kind of flammable liquid, set himself on fire, saying, "I will no longer participate in genocide, free Palestine." And there have been many, of course, the stupid lying media in the West try to say that he's mentally deranged. Well, actually, he is sane in comparison to the so-called leaders who are perpetrating the most unbelievable crimes against humanity, as we've seen, including the deranged, sadistic president of the United States, who is actively supporting, abetting, funding the genocide being carried out by Israel against the population of Gaza. Now, other soldiers, for example, in, I believe it was Washington, Oregon or Washington, had their own vigil in support of Bushnell's actions, where they removed their uniforms and set them on fire. There is a growing resistance. The whistleblower, Daniel Hale, the direct descendant of the American patriot Nathan Hale, said that, and who is sitting in prison because he exposed the crimes committed in drone warfare by the United States, the targeting of civilians. He said that the sentiment expressed publicly by Bushnell is much wider than you would think in the United States. And I would say that it is time for the leaders of the United States to stop abusing the goodwill and patriotism of our talented, dedicated young people who wish to serve the nation, who wish to contribute good in the world, and find themselves being ordered to commit atrocities against other human beings, which clearly weighs on their conscience, and which is why we have right now 20 soldier suicides per day in the United States. This policy must stop, and we are seeing a growing resistance. Now, on the insane war crime side, we had the spectacle in Gaza of truckloads of aid being delivered to the northern part by the Israeli Defense Forces. And when the desperately starving people were in line or gathering around the truck to get the food, the Israelis opened fire on them. They claimed they were only trying to get crowd control, but many of the people were shot in the head. That's not an accident. They killed over 100. There's over nearly 800 people were injured. It is likely that many of them will die because it's impossible to get to any hospital or healthcare because of the rubble, the broken down infrastructure. So the idea of firing on starving people who are trying to get food clearly is beyond reprehensible. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session to condemn this action, and the United States blocked it. And the line of the United States was, we don't really know what happened, which I believe it was the Russian economist Glaziev, but at any rate, someone said the United States doesn't have enough evidence to know that the IDF shot and killed over 100 people in line for food, but they knew immediately that Vladimir Putin was responsible for the death of the Russian dissident Navalny, which I think gets a certain ironic point. Now, also on the ugly to insane to thermonuclear war damaging, the Russians intercepted a conversation which has not been denied to be real. According to sources, it sounds very authentic, between four German Air Force officers discussing how to use the Taurus missiles, the long-range Taurus missiles, which Germany has not yet agreed to send to the Ukrainians to blow up the Crimea bridge. Clearly, that would put Germany in the crosshairs of Russia. You would have a war between Russia and NATO. Were that to occur. You also have the statements by the insane and also apparently physically ill Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, although no one knows what's wrong with him and he doesn't seem to consider it enough an issue to take care when he's on his way to the hospital to have someone in place to take up the command or follow orders. I mean, it really is insane in the United States. At any rate, Lloyd Austin said, if Ukraine falls, then it's war between NATO and Russia. That is an unbelievably irresponsible and dangerous statement from the Defense Secretary of the United States. So that's on the horror, the ugly, the gut-wrenching. Now, on the resistance, you have what just happened in the UK with the very outspoken peace activist intervener George Galloway, who just won an election to Parliament for the town of Rochdale in the UK, campaigning against genocide, campaigning against the slaughter in Gaza. This was a great shock. The media has tried everything to slander him. It's a huge victory. And then in the United States, in Michigan, you have a movement among Muslim voters and voters who are opposed to genocide, who want justice for Palestine. And they decided, as I keep saying, that there is no qualified president or presidential candidate. So in the Michigan Democratic presidential primary, they mobilized to get at least over 10,000 voters to vote uncommitted, demonstrating that they could sink Biden in the state because he only won the state in 2020 by a margin of 10,000 votes. While they were going for 10,000 votes, they got 101,000 votes for uncommitted. So what this demonstrates is the power of conscience and the power of people who believe that they may be powerless, who don't have giant funding from AIPAC or other mega companies, but have the power of their own conscience and ability to unite to be heard. Will this be enough? It depends very much on us. And it's in that context that I asked Joe Durso to discuss what happened at Nuremberg and various aspects of this. And it was actually the Soviet Union at the time that pushed particularly hard that the crimes of the Nazis should not just be covered up and forgotten, but that people had to be held accountable, that if you really meant never again, then the world would have to be confronted with what had actually occurred and how it occurred. And I'm not going to say more than that. Joe Durso is here with me. Unfortunately, his video's not working, but I think there's a photograph of him. Yes, there it is. So he's there from Rochester, New York. And Joe, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, let's see. Um, okay, what I want to do is just give people a sense of what the issues were and how the trials were conducted at Nuremberg. And I just want to say that um, international law is not a topic which is studied in the United States. I can tell you from personal experience that there are 33 topics in the New York State bar exam, and international law is not one of them. So chances are when you meet someone, even who's a lawyer, after this video, I think you'll know more about Nuremberg than that person. Um, there are some experts in the United States, Francis Boyle, for one, who prosecuted the um, Bosnian genocide, and of course, Ramsey Clark, who gave a spirited uh, defense and an exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. But for the most part, the legal profession and therefore people in the United States are ignorant of international law. It really starts with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That's considered the groundbreaking event in international law because it resulted in characterization of independent sovereign states having equal sovereignty regardless of their size and power and by non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. And there really isn't a lot more that's groundbreaking until we actually get to Nuremberg, because in between all kinds of international law discussed the issue of state to state relations, but did not deal with the conduct of individuals, particularly individuals within the countries involved. So that marks a change. So I'm going to kind of give a sense of how we got to Nuremberg, and then how the trial was conducted, and then the consequences and the follow up. Um, some of you may know that the International Court of Justice was created by the UN and operates out of The Hague. It has 15 permanent justices. It has the jurisdiction to hear cases involving states, but not individuals or organizations. All the states involved must be party to the ICJ, which is basically the entire UN. And it may be asked not only to make adjudications, but to give advisory opinions, as it did last week on the legality of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian properties. So I want to go next to the origins of how the idea of the Nuremberg trials came about. And they really began with the discussions among the three active Allied powers. And you see the picture there of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And I'm just going to, this is the big three. And I just want to read this excerpt from a wonderful book, the one by Elliot Roosevelt, where they first bring up the issue of what to do with the war criminals. So they're having this meeting in Tehran. Toward the end of the meal, Uncle Joe arose to propose his umpteenth toast. For a time, I had been trying to keep count, but then I was hopelessly lost, and it was on the subject of Nazi war criminals. I cannot hope to remember his words exactly, but it ran something like this. I propose a salute to the swiftest possible justice for all of Germany's war criminals, justice before a firing squad. I drink to our unity in dispatching them as fast as we capture them, all of them, and there must be at least 50,000. Quick as a flash, Roosevelt was on his feet. By the way, the PM stuck to his favorite brandy throughout the toasting. His nightly regimen of cognac prepared him for Russian-style conversations, but that night I suspect that even a redoubtable tippler such as he was finding his tongue thicker than usual. His face and neck were red. Any such attitude, he cried, is wholly contrary to our British sense of justice. The British people will never stand for such mass murder. I take the opportunity to say that I feel most strongly that no one, Nazi or no, shall be summarily dealt with before a firing squad without proper legal trial, no matter what the known facts and proven evidence. I glanced at Stalin. He was seemingly tickled, but his face remained serious. Only his eyes twinkled as he took up the PM's challenge and drew him on, suavely picking his argument, seemingly careless of the fact that Churchill's temper was hopelessly lost. At length, Stalin turned to Father and asked his opinion. Father, who had been hiding a smile, nevertheless felt that the moment was beginning to be too highly charged with bad feeling. It was his notion to inject a witticism. As usual, he said, it seems to be my function to mediate this dispute. Clearly, there must be some sort of compromise between your position, Mr. Stalin, and that of my good friend, the Prime Minister. Perhaps we could say that instead of summarily executing 50,000 war criminals, we should settle on a smaller number. Shall we say 49,500? So that was at a different time with a different president and a different relationship to the Soviet Union. So let's go on. How did the tribunal come about? It was done by a result of an agreement, the London Agreement of 1945, which was done between the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. It stated that individuals whose offenses had no particular geographic location would be tried by a tribunal sitting in Nuremberg, Germany, for crimes, war crimes, crimes against the peace, and crimes against humanity. Although the Allied Control Council was headquartered in Berlin, they chose Nuremberg for two reasons. One, its notoriety for being the center of the race laws and the huge rallies, but also because it hadn't been bombed that much and it happened to have a prison nearby, so it would make it convenient. So that's where it was. They chose that. The trial itself lasted for 11 months, basically, from November 1945 to October 1946. It ended up finding 19 individual defendants guilty and sentenced them to punishments that range from death by hanging, and there were a number of those, to 15 years imprisonment. 3 defendants were found not guilty. One had committed suicide prior to the trial, and one did not stand trial at all due to his physical and mental illnesses. That was Krupp. The Nuremberg Tribunal also included indictments of organizations, not just individuals. They were deemed to be criminal organizations under the terms of the charter. That included the leadership of the Nazi Party, the SS, which did all the things of the enslavement and extermination and so forth, the Nazi security police, commonly known as the SD, and the Gestapo, who had also been part of the slave labor and concentration camps. There were 3 organizations that were not indicted. I'll get to that later. What were the theories of war? Well, the difference between Nuremberg and everything else was that prior to that, the prosecution did not involve citizens of the countries involved. It was a state-to-state thing. I'm going to go to the next person, a very important person here who helped really come up with a lot of the ideas. His name is Aaron Treinin, and he was a Russian um, legal scholar and jurist. He was Jewish, and he really developed the concept that was the fundamental charge at Nuremberg: crimes against peace, um, which then became known as fighting an aggressive war. That is the major charge at Nuremberg. I know people think it's crimes against humanity or war crimes. No, the number one charge is crimes against peace. And it was really Trinine who came up with that. And he also developed the idea of complicity. He wrote an entire book on that. And his concept of the defense of only following orders, superior orders, was another thing that he dealt with. So much of what was actually the legal theories came from this Soviet legal theoretician. Um, he was not directly involved in the trial, but Robert Jackson was heavily influenced by him, and I'll get to that. Jackson was the prime American prosecutor. He was a New Yorker. He was born, well, he was actually born right over the border in Pennsylvania, but he grew up in a little town called Fewsburg, right on the border of Pennsylvania. And after graduating from Jamestown High School, he went to work for a year or so for his uncle, who had a law firm. And from there, he met FDR. He was introduced to FDR as a very young man. And then he went on to do 1 year of law school, which is all that he had to do because he had worked as a clerk, and became an attorney. And he had a very good career. Um, he moved up, he became a solicitor general, the attorney general. He was appointed to the Supreme Court by FDR, and to become the lead prosecutor at Nuremberg by Truman. He gave the opening presentation, which is the most cited and most stirring presentation for the prosecution, on the second day of the trials, and it lasted for 3.5 hours. It was 25,000 words, so I haven't read the whole thing. It's like quarter the size of a novel. But he some of the what we say here, if you can see that, oh, wait, let me go back. The peace of the world imposes a great responsibility. The wrongs which well, this is what he from his speech. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being reported. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. That's from his opening statement. I'm going to just go to the next slide, which is another very, very important jurist, I think, especially on the question of genocide. This is Raphael Lemkin, and he was a Polish Jew. Actually, he was born in what is now Belarus, and he is the main mind behind the concept of genocide, a word which he coined from his studies of the extermination of Jews and Armenians. He coined the term genocide from the Greek genos, meaning race, and the Latin side, meaning killing. That concept became popularized at the trial, and later became the basis for the Genocide Convention of 1948. I put this out because if you don't know what what Lemkin was speaking about, I would suggest that you do a little research to what is called General Plan Ost. Now, this was actually a plan drawn up by the Nazis in extreme detail, country by country, which divided the people into categories: those who had Aryan blood who could be spared, those who had a partial Aryan blood who could become slaves, and everybody else gets exterminated. And it was detailed. It had all the numbers, and it was the basis on which the movement for Lebensraum and the invasion of Eastern Europe and Russia was based. I put this if you want to get a sense of the brutality, this, in my opinion, this movie Come and See, which was a 1985 movie produced in the Soviet Union, is probably the best war movie. It's really an anti-war movie ever made, and gives a sense of what had happened. The losses, of course, for the Soviet Union were staggering: 27 million, at least 15 million civilians. And as a result of that, Trenin, really, he proposed, the first one to propose about crimes against civilians because of what had happened in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And that was reformulated by Robert Jackson to be crimes against humanity. And that was one of the charges at Nuremberg. Okay. Let me just say the way the court was structured. There were 4 allied nations at the time: the US, USSR, UK, and France. There was some controversy as to why France should be allowed, but that was what was going on with the UN. And each of them was given a prosecutor and 2 judges, one judge and one alternate. There were probably over 1,000 people involved in the prosecution, and for whatever reasons, 2/3 of them were American. This is a picture of the defendant's dock. Well, there were 24 named defendants who were grouped according to their role in the Nazi leadership, the military, political, and economic structures. When it came down to choosing them, the British wanted 12. That was it, 12, and they really didn't even want to have a trial. They just, despite all the stuff that Churchill said, really all they wanted to do was just let's just summarily execute them, which would have defeated the whole purpose of having the trial, because Jackson wanted, he had a much longer list, because it was to be a lesson and it was to be made public, and there were specific goals in mind. The French added 1 person, and the Soviets added 2 people that were not added. They were referred to further trials. So in addition to the individual defendants, Jackson planned to try 14 organizations and their leaders, but this was pared down to 6. The 6 that were indicted were the Reich Cabinet, the leadership corps of the Nazi Party, the Gestapo, SA, SS, and the SD. Why did he want the organizations? Because he did not want to have a situation where only the top leadership was held to be responsible for the crimes of Nazi Germany, nor did he want to have collective punishment for the entire population. So to find the way to mediate those extremes, he brought against these organizations, which you'll see are actually quite large. What were the charges? There were 4 charges that were brought at Nuremberg, and these are the order of importance. I have here Hermann Goering as an example. Charge number one was common plan or conspiracy for a crime against the peace. Conspiracy. That was the number one crime. Every single defendant was charged with that. Number two was a waging a war of aggression or other crimes against peace. So carrying out the conspiracy. Then these are ranked in order of severity. Three was war crimes, and four was crimes against humanity. So, as I said in his opening statement, Jackson made it clear he was not seeking collective punishment or to convict the entire German people of crime. The Soviet prosecutor, Rudenko, was understandably fixated primarily on the war crimes and crimes against humanity and in the treatment of Soviet POWs and on the systematic murder of Jews. I don't know if people have realized that there were 6 million Russian soldiers taken prisoner during the war. They were worked to death on minimal amount of food like everyone else in the concentration camps. And out of the 6 million, 3.6 million died in the camps. So 60% never made it out. And then, of course, there was the systematic murder of the Jews, which the Soviet delegation put up front. The defense strategy. Basically, the defense strategy was very simple. They blamed everything on Hitler. They really had nothing else to say. It was Hitler's fault. They were just following orders. Over the course of the trial, the charges of crimes against humanity gradually overshadowed the aggressive war charge, which, as I said, is the most severe charge in the mind of Trinine and, of course, in Jackson. Aggressive war being the key to everything else, and conspiracy to create it being the necessity prerequisite. By the end of the trial, all of the prosecutors except the United States began to use the word genocide. Let's see. Okay, I wanted to just say, how did they get together the evidence? Because this was important. They had to prepare this thing. From the time after the London conference, the tact of the British and American prosecutors was to focus on documents and affidavits from testimony. While this made a strong case legally, it was not as dramatic, and it was not as well reported. I think the New Yorker called it the Temple of Boredom. And they relied heavily on reports from the OSS, the American Jewish Committee, and others. Altogether, the prosecution called 37 witnesses. The defense called 83. The prosecution examined 110,000 German documents and entered 4,600 into evidence, along with 19 miles of film and 25,000 photographs. So what had happened during the course of the trial was that the things shifted from the aggressive war, as I said, to screening of the Nazi concentration camps and prison camps, which was kind of shocked the public. Again, Jackson, his intent was not to convict the entire German people, but he did want the trials to, also didn't want them to seemingly absolve the German people, except for the 21 people who were in the dock. So they showed these films. When the Soviet prosecutor got to his, they had much more effective films. They had produced three films of showing the atrocities. starting with they had films of the Soviet prisoners of war, the starvation of Leningrad, and the systematic murder of Jews. Um, they showed scenes of the destructions of the villages that occurred throughout Eastern Europe, and they showed how there was attempts to cover up the murder of children, the atrocities, the plunders, the confiscation of cultural heritage. All this sound familiar? Inspired by the films. The two really the knockouts were one on the liberation of Majdanek, which was the first concentration camp discovered by the Red Army in June of 1944, and then the liberation of Auschwitz. And it was even more disturbing than anything the Americans had showed. Um, so the it was so horrible that they had to adjourn the court for a day. But as I said, in the end, the American prosecutors were the only ones who never used the word genocide. What happened? Eight defendants were convicted of the conspiracy charge, which was considered the most important. They were therefore they were also found guilty of crimes against peace. If you look at the Goering, number one is conspiracy, number two is war of aggression, number three is war crimes, and four is crimes against humanity. So Goering was a straight all four, and of course was executed. Actually, he committed suicide a few hours before he was to be hung. Interestingly enough, the crimes against humanity concerning German Jews before 1939, the ones in Germany, were not under the court's jurisdiction because the prosecution had not proven a connection to aggressive war. Aggressive war is the key to the whole thing. Four organizations were ruled to be criminal: the leadership core of the Nazi Party, the SS, the Gestapo, and the SD. The SA, the Reich Cabinet, and the General Staff of the Wehrmacht were acquitted. Were not ruled to be criminal organizations. That was objected to by the Russian delegation. The sentences, I won't go into all of them. Let's see. Let's go to the next one. The verdict. The verdict came out on October 1st, 1946. And here you see some German citizens reading the verdicts. And there was, of course, shock throughout Germany, but surprisingly, they were accepted by a good part of the population because the trials were so shocking. There were the acquittals, including Schacht and the Soviet judge dissented in all three acquittals and wrote something which was unique to Soviet law, which was a dissent. They didn't have such a thing, and he was helped by the alternate British judge who wrote a dissent against the acquittal of Schacht and the others. So that's not the end of the story. Those are the convictions of the top leadership. What we probably don't hear much about was the denazification which followed, because after the trials, there was an intense campaign based upon the labeling of these organizations as criminal organizations, which meant that now, if they're criminal organizations, they could be prosecuted. And the term denazification, which was coined by the Pentagon, came into use. Unfortunately, these trials no longer involved all four parties as the Cold War began to show its ugly face. And so they were all conducted in the separate sectors. Um, the um, uh, the British handed over denazification panels to the Germans in January of 46. The Americans did so in March of 46. The French ran the most lenient ones, um, uh, really not much at all. And the program was very hugely unpopular in West Germany, where many Nazis still maintained positions of power and imposed by the government of Konrad and Adenauer. Um, Nonetheless, here's what happened. Um, there were 80 million people in Germany before the war, and 8 million were members of the Nazi Party, 10%. However, the Nazis had a huge web of organizations connected to them, like the German Labor Front, which had 25 million members, and the Nazi People's Welfare Organization, which had 17 million. So altogether, the Nazi-related organizations had 45 million people. And out of 80 million, and you figure 60 million adults, that means 75% of the population were involved in some Nazi organization. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to, try every one of them? Well, that wasn't something that Jackson wanted to do, but they did try a great number. In the US sector, 10,000 people were arrested. They only tried about 200, but there were interested certain categories. They had trials for doctors, the ones who have been conducting the medical experiments, the lawyers and judges trials, the people who had pushed through the racial purity programs. And I must say, 90% of the lawyers in Germany were members of the Nazi Party. They had trials for the ministries, and they intended to have trials for the industrialists. Only Flick, Farben, and Krupp were tried because they profited from slave labor and of course, the atrocities that were committed. They also tried some of the SS and the military high command. In the Soviet sector, they arrested 90,000, and they expropriated the land of the Junkers, who were big landowners. Altogether, there were 2 million former Nazis or members of the Nazi parties who were barred from taking any jobs except for manual labor. And between 1945 and 1950, 400,000 were imprisoned. So we're looking at huge numbers here. It went beyond that. Not only did they bring down the legal charges, but there was a ideological campaign. The U.S. Army in the American zone took control of German media. By July of 46, they had 37 newspapers, 6 radio stations, 315 theaters, 650 movie theaters, 101 magazines, 237 book publishers, and 7,500 book dealers and printers. They took control of all of that. And there was not only they called it democratization, but there was also a prohibition of criticism of anything of the Allied occupation forces. They issued a directive that they could confiscate any media that could contribute to Nazism or militarism. They drew up a list of 30,000 book titles ranging from school books to poetry, then banned. All copies of the books on the list were confiscated and destroyed. The possession of the book on this list was made a punishable crime. Millions of these books were confiscated and destroyed, and it's ironic in that this was happening in the country where book burning had become notorious. So this was an extensive program, this denazification, and it only slowed down when, because of the Cold War, believing that it undermined the fight against communism. Okay, so I'm going to go to what are the takeaways from this trial? Oh, this is a certificate. People were classified from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 according to their allegiance and their involvement in the Nazi Party. One is somebody who 5 would be a top-ranking Nazi. 1 would be someone who was not involved. Like 2 would be a follower. So this is from the British zone. You had to have papers, so this is showing that you were cleared. For whatever that you proved your whatever your status in regard to the denazification. Before we go to this, here are the principles that came out of this. 1, any person who commits a crime under international law is responsible and liable for prosecution. 2, the fact that internal law does not impose a penalty for an act which constitutes a crime under international law does not relieve the person who committed the act from responsibility. In other words, if a country has says it's okay to commit, genocide, that's not going to work. The international law supersedes. 3, the fact that the person who committed the act which constitutes the crime under international law acted as the head of state does not relieve him from responsibility. Attention, President Biden. The fact that a person acted pursuant to an order does not relieve him of responsibility. And 5, a person charged with a crime has a right to a fair trial. This was something that we insisted on. The British said, let's just have a summary executions, and the Russians said, well, let's have a presumption of guilt and we'll have the trial. Well, that's not really how it works. So here are the crimes. In order: participation in a conspiracy for waging the crime of war against peace. 2, planning, participating in a war of aggression. 3, war crimes such as murder, ill treatment, deportation for slave labor or any other purpose, or in occupied territories, the killing of hostages, plunder of property, wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages not militarily justified. Crimes against humanity: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts against a civilian population based on political, racial, religious grounds when such acts are carried out in connection with any crime against peace or war crime. So again, conspiracy, a war of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity. That's the order. And of course, number 7, complicity in any of the above crimes. Now, I'm just going to go quickly because there was a trial in the Far East for Japanese war criminals, and it was pretty much based upon what had happened and what was taking place in Nuremberg. At the time of the Potsdam Declaration, the war in Europe had ended, but Japan was still continuing, so the Soviet Union did not sign the declaration because it was not at war with Japan until weeks later, the same day that the U.S. dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, August 9th. Then Japan surrendered on August 14th. At the Moscow conference held in December, the Soviet Union, the UK, and the United States, with concurrence from China, agreed to the following: that General MacArthur, as Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, was granted authority to issue all orders for the implementation of terms of surrender. So this was different. It was basically handed over to MacArthur, who established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and it had the jurisdiction to try individuals for those crimes which I had just mentioned. It began on April 29th, 1946, and it was held in Tokyo. And when the prosecution opened its case, the defendants were charged with the 4 crimes that I had mentioned. It continued longer for 2.5 years. and there were 419 witnesses and 4,500 exhibits and affidavits from about 800. The charges were similar. Class A were charges of the crime against the peace, i.e., waging a war of aggression. It only applied to the top leaders who had planned and directed the war, like the war. There was no prerequisite to prosecution for conspiracy. Class B charges were conventional war crimes, violations of war crimes such as the rape of Nanking, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Bataan Death March. Class C covered everything else, again, the crimes against humanity, the systematic violence, the deportation, the enslavement of any civilian population. If you're not familiar, the Japanese atrocities, the Nazis had nothing over them. They were unbelievable in scope and in every degree. The indictment. I'll just go on to this. The chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, he issued a press statement. War and treaty breakers should be stripped of all glamour as national heroes and exposed for what they really are, plain, ordinary murderers. One difference is that this trial went back to 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria, so that those crimes could be charged. I'll point out that neither the imperial family at MacArthur's insistence, nor the notorious Unit 731, the biochem warfare, well, all the experiments which the Japanese did, which killed between 300,000 and 400,000 people, they were not charged. Following the tribunal, 5,700 people were arrested, 1,000 were sentenced to death, 1,000 were acquitted. That is the IMT Far East. I'm just going to say, here's what kind of ends that. But then there's something else, and that is the Genocide Convention of 1948. Lemkin, who was the Polish jurist who had such an influence on Nuremberg, felt that the trials at Nuremberg did not go far enough, and that the issue of genocide was not brought to the center as he believed it. So he was dogged about this and lobbied very hard for a genocide convention, which did come about in 1948. And as I said, all the prosecutors except the U.S. had invoked the term genocide at Nuremberg. Lemkin had been called on by Robert Jackson, but at the time there was no such word as genocide. He created it and he forced it. So here's what I'm just going to briefly say without going through what happened. The Genocide Convention was adopted by law by the UN General Assembly in 1948, confirming genocide is a crime. Now, if you listen to the definitions, and I think you'll hear something. Article 2. Any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Does that sound familiar? That's almost word for word what the ICJ charged Israel with violating this, that Israel had to abide by this. These were the grounds on which they were violating the convention, which they insisted on. Um, the crimes that are punishable under that convention are genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempts to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. It's like every one of those was done the night before last. The last thing I'll say is that in order to have the crime, there had to be two elements. One was the mental element of specific intent, and then the other being the commission of the acts themselves. And if you had the fortune to watch the brilliant presentation by South Africa at the genocide hearings, they specifically addressed both of those separately in 84 amazing pages. I will say that even though we, the United States, were a big force in the creation of the Genocide Convention in 1948, we didn't sign it until 40 years later, to 1988. And even then, we had the caveat that even if an American is found guilty under the Genocide Convention, punishment can only be meted out if the U.S. government itself concurs. So you need the consent of the U.S. government to prosecute. And that's what I got.
Well, thank you very much. Are you able to exit the screen sharing so we can
Yeah.
the photograph of you again?
Let me see if I'm here. Um, um, am
Yeah,
I on?
there you are.
Oh,
Yep,
okay.
you're there.
I am. Okay.
Yeah, so I have to say, I find this question of denazification, which occurred in Germany, to be very interesting because, of course, that's what Russia is talking about Ukraine needing to do. Also, the numbers that you gave, that only 10% of the German population was officially in the Nazi party, but there were all these institutions which involved up to 75% of the adult population. And I was reflecting on comments by various of the Nazi groups in Ukraine. I think it was the C14, is that's what they're called, about the white race,
Yeah.
rather? Yeah, and they said that what they brought to the Maidan is 8%. So they had 8% pro-Nazi forces, which created the dynamic of this total fascist brutality, which is what you see in Ukraine. It is a Nazi fascist state. You see that now in Israel. I think it's very hard to know in Ukraine as well as Israel, because the leadership, it's a dictatorship where people are tortured and beaten and jailed and so on, to actually, with any accuracy, know what the majority of people thinks, because people are too afraid to express their opinion if it is contrary to what is being promoted by the dictator. But I think this is a very interesting idea, the denazification. How do you actually do it? And the whole question of burning and destroying books, is there a way to do that actually through education, through willfully transforming the culture? We've certainly seen it in the contrary, where they've destroyed the culture, degraded the image of man, promoted quote unquote music, which I call noise, which glorifies total bestiality. Could you do that in the reverse? At any rate, you've been looking at this more recently, and I'd like to know what you think about this process.
The denazification,
Yeah,
it was on a massive scale. Um, uh, of course, the U.S. sector was the largest, but well, probably East Germany was larger. Um, but uh, it was so thorough, and I didn't even go through everything that they did. It was only attenuated by the fact that the Cold War came out. There were a lot of proposals, about. The Morgenthau plan was Morgenthau wanted to deindustrialize Germany, turn it into a pasture with subsistence level farming. That was scrapped because they figured out that if they destroyed Germany, they would destroy the entire European economy, and then I guess the fears that the communists would take over and so forth. But from what we know is what I said. It extended in all spheres into literature, into the theaters, into the movie houses. Um, in addition to the trials, and the numbers are, yes, 10%, but when you figure 45 million people were involved in some way, um, that's a hefty percentage. Okay, so 500,000 were jailed over that time, and 2 million people were barred from having anything but menial jobs. So it was a very, very big effort. I can't really say too much about what happened on the Soviet sector, which became East Germany. It was more severe. Um, in both cases, certain sections of the Nazi apparatus was maintained, and the American side, integrated into the intelligence services.
Well, you think about the significance in this context of the Iron Curtain speech, and also I was thinking back on an interview that Fletcher Prouty did with Jeff Steinberg, where he talks about, I forget if it was just after Casablanca, or no, maybe it was right after the Iran meeting, being on an airplane with what he thought were American POWs, which were being flown, I think, through Turkey, Northern Africa to go back to the United States. And he walked through the plane and he discovered a group of people that clearly were not emaciated American POWs. They were Romanian Nazi collaborators who were being brought into the United States already. This is before the war even ended.
Yeah.
To figure out how to destroy the Soviet Union, to join our fight against communism, supposedly. Um, so I think it's also there. Clearly, there were many factions, and the British really wanted to continue their game of the destruction of the Soviet Union and Germany. Germany having been defeated, they still wanted to defeat the Soviet Union, and that influence in our intelligence agencies, State Department, military, was very strong. And then you also still had a bit the leftover legacy of Franklin Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Eleanor Roosevelt, Kennedy, what Lyndon LaRouche came out of, more on the actual anti-fascist, anti-colonial American tradition.
Well,
But
it's hard
go
to
on.
say how, when you talk about Ukraine, how much support the Banderists have, but it is important to notice that even after the war, they were absorbed into the CIA and MI6, and they continued sabotage in the Soviet Union, throughout Ukraine and the Soviet Union up until 1954. There were guerrilla attacks. So they've been revived, but I don't know. You got the right sector, you got Svoboda, you've got the Azov, you've got C-13. So you have a bunch of different groups. But as far as their support within the population, it's hard to say. Now, I think Israel's a different matter. I think the support within Israel for genocide is much higher. If you listen to like Finkelstein or Aaron Mate or Blumenthal, they say it runs as high as 80%. That the hatred that's been built towards the Palestinian people is so extensive, and it's down into the schools. When you have people, young people, holding raves outside of the entry points for the aid, and it's a party. They have music, they have food, everything, and they're preventing the aid from coming in.
Right.
And the government does
Have them.
nothing about it. So I mean, I think the re-education um, tasks ahead of us, both cases are going to be big. I do think that we're going to see Nuremberg trials soon. I think that as we know, the Ukraine, the military is fragmenting and collapsing, and this war may be over by the summer. I think before that happens, we're going to see trials in both Donetsk and Moscow. There's going to be, uh, I don't, the Azov, these things, they are keeping track of them. If they had such extensive uh, the way they kept track during War Two, and things are so much different today. It's right out, in all the cases, it's right out on the TV. It's
Right.
not like you have to dig for it.
No, but I think that's also where you see the hideous problem in the United States, that you would have people attempting to justify the most hideous
Yes.
atrocities. And I'm thinking about our culture because I know a few decades ago there were certain laws, like you wouldn't cover in explicit detail in the press some hideous, like a pedophile. You wouldn't put in the newspaper the details of how the crime was committed or what was done, because you didn't want to encourage people to do it. You didn't want to provide an instruction manual of how to be a, sadist mass murderer. Now, this is in our films, it's in our culture, and it's in the papers, where any 3, 4, 5 year old can read it if they can read, but or also the massive abuse of children. We have a very, very sick culture where people literally take a kind of sadistic pleasure in doing harm to others. And that's what I think we have a collision course,
Mm-hmm.
because on the other hand, you see there's a huge number of people who still are anguished about it, as we saw with Aaron Bushnell, or
Mm-hmm.
as we see
Mm-hmm.
with the tens of thousands of young people who are in the streets protesting the genocide. But I do think we have to come to terms with how hideously ugly our view of man has become as a general cultural dynamic.
Yeah, I think your comment about portraying Aaron Bushnell as being insane. Well, who are these sane ones, and who's insane? I mean, if you're not moved by what's going on, there's something wrong, something very seriously wrong.
Yeah, now there's a couple things. Our good friend Jeff Young from Kentucky has been writing a few
Oh,
comments.
really?
One, he was asking about a judge from India at Nuremberg,
Oh,
who was according, he said, I heard from Noam Chomsky that the judge from India wrote a 700-page dissent that called the whole Nuremberg trial victor's justice, that the only reason German officials were put on trial is that they lost. And he claimed that the Allies did most of the same crimes. I will just say, I don't think that's true. And I know, for example, our dear friend William Warfield, the musician who was very fluent in German, um, was brought in to gather intelligence at camps of German POWs. And we didn't torture people, but we did get them drunk, and he sang a bunch of German lieder and German songs and got them talking freely, and all kinds of things spilled out under those circumstances. And I also understand that one of the reasons why so many of the POWs wanted to remain in the United States is they were blown away by how well treated they were versus what they were doing to prisoners. One of them said, I even got a toothbrush. I was put in an American prison. I even had a toothbrush. Or George Washington started the tradition absolutely no torture. It's not to say there weren't exceptions, and we've certainly gotten worse since the end of World War II, but there had been a principle in the United States very strongly against torture, for example, and other atrocities.
Well, I could say nobody's hands were clean going into the Nuremberg. I mean,
Mhm.
we had Dresden, we had Hiroshima and
Right,
Nagasaki, but
right.
it was it's one of the reasons that Jackson wanted to make the supreme crime the conspiracy to commit aggression and the war of aggression, because it's from that everything else flowed. And um, I'm aware of this comment by the Indian judge, but the Indian this would be in the Far East, because there were 11, all the countries involved in the war with Japan, which included China and the Dutch and others, Australia, were there. But when it comes to Nuremberg, it was only the four principles that we spoke of. So I mean, it's the same charge that it's victor's justice was actually leveled by against Robert Jackson by
Wow.
his predecessor at the Supreme Court, who said you're just going there to, basically it's just you're going there for show, and it was not true,
Right,
because Jackson's purpose was not there simply to obtain convictions, but to teach a lesson and a history lesson and bring out the full scope of things to the world. Um, and that's why it was, it went far beyond the 24 people that were indicted.
right. Well, I think also from what you read, both from the crimes at Nuremberg, what a crime against humanity constitutes, which we very clearly see Israel perpetrating against Palestine, the Palestinian people now, or the genocide conventions, which is exactly what the International Court of Justice ruled, the importance of setting that precedent. If mankind were to choose to become better, you have the standards, they exist. So obviously it was important. It's just that we have to decide that we're going to uphold those principles. Uh, and I think that's the open question, particularly for Americans. Are we going to hold our government responsible for upholding a certain standard of humanity? And will we embody that ourselves? Because when the leadership becomes corrupt and the culture is corrupt and ugly, you see it trickles down to the lowest level. And people are depraved in the small as well as in the large. And that's the challenge I think that we face. I think we're well over time. This really was very useful. You were absolutely right. I think what you presented, most people have no idea of, haven't thought about it. We've heard terms like denazification, but trying to imagine what that means, what they did in Germany, I certainly didn't, I really had no idea of how massive that effort was. Do you have any closing thoughts, Joe?
No, I think you summed it up, and it really is a question for us. Um, keep hammering on the government and our government, because I think you've said it before with regard to Vietnam, that the real losers were the American people, because the degradation of sitting by and doing nothing and watching this go on is the moral decay that is taking hold, and we are the ones who are going to lose if we do nothing.
Exactly. And that's what Daniel Hale said, the moral wound. And Lyndon LaRouche said that also to a dear friend of ours from Iraq. who is rightfully enraged that the Americans killed 1 million Iraqis. And Mr. LaRouche said to him, yes, but the harm to the American people will be greater and longer lasting because the wounds of the spirit are, in a way, they're eternal unless you address them. So that's the challenge. And I think we can rise to that, but it's not guaranteed. So I want to thank you again. And I would like to tell everybody we're getting close to the petitioning, which begins on April 16th. And my campaign and the campaign of Jose Vega are going to be collaborating on this. I need, or we need, the campaigns need $80,000 in the bank before that, and we need volunteers. And if you are eligible to vote in any state, that is, you're a US citizen registered to vote or could be registered to vote, you are welcome to come to New York and gather signatures. So there's no reason for anybody not to be getting signatures to make sure that I and Jose get on the ballot. I want to invite you to come here. I'd like to invite you to donate to SARE for Senate. And I hope that we are lucky enough to be with each other again next week. So thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Joe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.